Welcome to this edition of Rattling the Bars, a show that amplifies the voices of people who are disenfranchised, marginalized, and subjugated by offering solutions. Joining me today to talk about a report published by the Justice Policy Institute entitled The Right Investment, which examines how the lack of funding in neighborhoods, coupled with the lack of investment in housing, education, economic development, and public health, devastate communities, causing them into a downward spiral, is Shekhinah, Braveheart, Advocacy Associate at the Justice Policy Institute, and Ryan King of Justice Policy Institute. Welcome to Rattling the Bars.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm. So let's just dive right into it. Justice Policy Institute published a report called The Right Investment 2.0, How Maryland Can Create Safe and Healthy Communities. All right, let's start with you, Shekhinah. Now, and the reason why I'm asking this question, right, because it's a whole lot of reports that then came out about poverty, impoverished situation. I think it's one of the most infamous reports that came out in 1970. The Kerner report, I think it was. We talk about poverty throughout the United States. What is so unique about this report and all its implications that when you juxtapose against other reports, it doesn't replicate what they're saying? It got some individuality to it.
Yeah, so the Right Investment 2.0, our newest, and it's an interactive report. It expands the scope of understanding by examining the impact of concentrated criminal legal involvement in specific neighborhoods, coupled with the historic lack of investment in housing, education, economic development, public health, and how it creates this devastation, and communities are locked into this downward spiral of disadvantage. And, like I said, it's historical. So this lack of investment and criminal legal involvement has this multi-generational impact. The one thing about this report is that it offers some perspective on how long-term and strategic investments can uplift and even, uplift even the most challenging neighborhoods. So the problem is not insurmountable. Okay. That's the difference. We're just not defining the problem. We're looking also and offering some perspective on how long-term, and I stress long-term, because there's been long-term investment in policing and prosecutors and prisons, but there's rarely long-term in the points in the areas that I just mentioned to you. So how those strategic investments can improve the conditions that we found ourselves in East Baltimore communities.
And in terms of Baltimore, well, we recognize that, and me in particular, I've served 48 years in the prison system, in Maryland in particular. And 48 years I served a percentage of it in the Maryland Penitentiary. I served basically every institution with the exception of a few. But within that population, the majority of the population that was there when I first came in was in Baltimore. I went to Maryland Penitentiary in 1973. The Maryland Penitentiary population in 1973, 75 to 80% of the population came out of Baltimore. So in terms of the identity of Baltimore, Ryan, why did y'all dive down on Baltimore and not look at across the board? Why did the report isolate itself to Baltimore in particular?
Sure. So there's a couple of things. The first being Baltimore now is about 10% of the state population, but comprises about 1 in 3 people that are in state prison. So a big chunk of the people that are locked up in state prisons in the state of Maryland came from the city of Baltimore. It is the largest city in the state, and it matters, I think, because it allows us, it gives us an opportunity to dive deeply into specific neighborhoods. I think there's this question about how policy affects crime, who's being incarcerated, and to some degree what effects that's having on communities. And in a place like Baltimore, you're able to go from neighborhood to neighborhood and see stark differences in a whole host of different indicators. So you're able to look at it at one neighborhood right next to another neighborhood or a
Right.
short distance away that has high rates of incarceration, and then, as we've said earlier, is historically disadvantaged on education, on housing, healthcare, life expectancy. It's just a myriad of different factors. And so Baltimore gives us an opportunity to look at all these things. And I think what we see in the end picture is really this is what structural racism looks like. These are neighborhoods that are historically disadvantaged in almost every single indicator you can find. And oh, by the way, they also have the highest rates of incarceration. And that's not some sort of coincidence. And so I think to be able to dive into a city and then go neighborhood by neighborhood and be able to see that, wow, the neighborhoods that are having all of these problems also have these problems. It allows us to step back and then I think begin to see that these things are all interrelated with one another. This is not a criminal legal issue. This is not a housing issue. It's not an education issue. It's how we invest in our communities. And as Shekhinah mentioned, when we think about police, prosecutors, and prisons, those are investments. We should be thinking about those as investments. Those are dollars going into the system and not into the communities. And these outcomes and negative outcomes that we see are a direct reflection of that.
And I like that. I like that the way you frame that, because this is what I thought was unique about the report. And like I said earlier, it's other reports that came out, but this what I thought was unique about the report was that it's saying that if we take and invest in creating holistic environments for people, then we won't have what we know to be the Maryland prison system. So I like that concept of investment. But look, let's peel back some of the layers of this report. And because the way the report was set up, you have categories, and in each category or each topic, y'all make an analysis of how the socioeconomic political conditions contribute to, and then how the lack of investment help aid and assist in penalizing poverty. Let's start with the communities of disproportionate impact. Shekhinah, talk about that. What exactly do that mean to the layperson?
Well, we looked at, I think it was 60 socioeconomic indicators from each of the Baltimore neighborhoods that allowed us to explore the relationship more deeply between criminal legal system involvement and the lack of neighborhood investment. So they're broad, but for instance, the same communities that are disadvantaged across the range of indicators are the ones with the highest incarceration. So they're also the ones with a higher unemployment rate, the lowest of household incomes, the lower educational attainment, higher rates of violence, higher rates of health issues, cancer, other forms of mortality, lower life expectancy. So these things parallel, sadly, the same socioeconomic factors and public health across the board would equal the indicators or the conditions that I just outlined.
Well, so for example, in Sandtown, Winchester, versus like maybe Bolton Hill or one of the more affluent areas in Baltimore, we was Eddie Conway and some few other people. They had what they call the Tubman House, and they had a community center in Sandtown at Gilmore and Gilmore projects, and we was down there last year doing an event, and the community been decimated. The amount of wasn't a lot of kids there no more. They have like a lot of areas is boarded up. But I knew this when I came out and I was in that area. I remember this area. Only the way I remember this area was a lot of the guys that was locked up with me came out of Gilmore projects. So is this like an indicator of what you're talking about?
Yes, it was, like you said, Sandtown, Winchester, Greater Rosemont, Harlem Park, Southwest Baltimore. We did the first TRI, the right investment, in 2015. 8 years later, those are still the top 5 most impacted communities. 8
Right.
years later.
Okay, and Ryan,
So it hasn't changed. If anything, got
yeah,
worse.
exactly. No, I agree because like I said, I did all that time in the prison system. When I came out, we was in Baltimore doing some work, and this was the first time I had actually been out in the street and wasn't handcuffed or riding in a van. And when I got out the truck, I realized that, oh, I can walk up and down the street in my mind. And as I was walking up and down the street, I seen the area that we was in. I seen the devastation. I seen like trash everywhere. I seen like, it was I'm boarded up houses every
Right.
4 houses. So how can the people have the psyche, the sense of community? How can I have a sense of community if I live on the block I live, it's 20 houses on the block, like 11 of them is boarded up,
Right.
and I'm in between whatever, and people taking it just throwing trash out, whatever. But Brian, and talk about the community indicators in terms of how this report focused on and looked at some of the community indicators, and how did they see these things came about?
Sure. And let me just share while I have an opportunity here to get a sense of the kind of numbers we're talking about. We've mentioned a few neighborhoods here. And so you mentioned Sandtown, Winchester, Harlem Park. So just to give your viewers a sense, there's a little under 11,000 people that live in that neighborhood. It's 92.5% Black. And there's an incarceration rate of 2,562 per 100,000. So 277 people in that neighborhood are incarcerated. Now I'm going to compare that to Greater Roland Park, Poplar Hill. 7,200 people live there. It is 74% white, only 9% Black, and there's one incarcerated person in the entire neighborhood. So it gives you a little bit of a sense about what we're talking about, and your viewers can also go to our website, and Shekhinah mentioned it's an interactive resource, so it actually allows you to kind of go and float over each neighborhood and get a sense of what these numbers are. And you'll see time and time again, the neighborhoods, they are 90+% Black are the ones that have all of the worst socioeconomic indicators and the highest rates of incarceration.
Right.
And so the community indicators, as you mentioned, we took a look at things like unemployment, household income, and poverty levels, but even things like Shekhinah had mentioned, health, so around elevated blood levels. We looked at educational attainment, mortality rates, truancy rates, vacant abandoned properties, and all of these, as you can imagine, the same neighborhoods. I mentioned Sandtown, Winchester, the highest arrest data, the highest calls for 911 service, the lowest rates of high school attainment, and then if you were to flip to Greater Roland Park, Poplar Hill, you'll see the exact opposite. I mean, it's neighborhood after neighborhood, and these are all in the same city, all in the same state, right? So you should not be seeing these differences. Again, that's getting back to your first question about the importance of being able to see it under one government in the city of Baltimore. These differences tells you that, right? This is more than just a location, right? These are the results of direct decisions about where to invest resources and what types of resources to invest in.
And I recall, like I said, when I first came into the system in Baltimore, in Maryland, in Baltimore in particular. I recall when where we see the harbors at now, all the more affluent areas. They was like warehouses down there. The guys that was from Baltimore, they had all the high rises projects that was in. All of them came out them areas that they ultimately demolished. But them areas they later on became prime real estate, and now what we see is the inner harbor and the money they invested in the harbor. You go like a couple of miles left or a couple of miles right, and you don't see nothing but blight. And in terms of that, how do we reconcile that when we have in the city of Baltimore? How do you reconcile that in the city of Baltimore? You have up until O'Malley, you've had predominantly a Black administration. How do y'all report jail with that? In terms, or was that a factor that y'all took into account in this report?
Well, I would say, and I'm a Baltimore resident. I would offer that, there are levels of leadership. Of course, there is, the governor over the state, and then we have the various counties, and then we have the mayors of the city. It all comes down to where are they making the investments? What's important to them? You
Hmm.
talked about blight in these areas just between a few blocks and another. I recently moved just 10 blocks. All I moved was 10 blocks. Where I live now, where I lived before, our streets were clean because there was what do you call it? Street sweeping truck,
Yeah, yeah.
sanitation truck that came down our block twice a week, and our block was clean. Now, just 10 blocks later, trash everywhere.
Hmm.
So, but this is a city service that our tax dollars pay for.
Right.
Now, who decides what neighborhoods, what streets get cleaned and which ones do not? We would think that that would just be a service that's offered across the board, but it's not. So it can be disheartening. It can be demoralizing for people who live in these communities where half the block is boarded up, had burnt out buildings, busted windows, graffiti, all those things. It just creates that cycle. But decisions are made. So one of the great things about this report and others that are like it is that it shines a light on what the problems are, and then we can make recommendations as to how to fix them, starting at the highest of the highest levels all the way down to community partners, of those who are closest to the problem, who can probably identify where the investment priorities should be better than anybody else because they're closest to it.
Right. And in terms of the health and wellness, we recognize that the high rate of immortality. We recognize that in terms of the psychic of the people, that Baltimore is known for. This is how they describe Baltimore in the criminal element. Say Baltimore is known as a heroin town. Like in terms of like they sell heroin in Baltimore. So in terms of like the trauma that's associated with this poverty. Ryan, talk about the wellness and the health and how that impacts on the community overall.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you're talking about in a lot of these communities, we've been discussing the actual sort of state of the buildings, the street access to healthy food, which can be limited in a lot of these communities. And then also high rates of violence, which, as you're saying, it is traumatic to live in a neighborhood with high rates of violence. It is traumatic to live in a neighborhood with high rates of sickness and high mortality. And lack of access to all the supports and services that an individual might need that has access in other neighborhoods as close as 10 blocks away, as
Right.
Shekhinah's mentioned. But I think that the reality of living in those communities and what it is like, and what we hear consistently from people who have to live in those communities about the trauma of being subjected to the violence, the concern and worry for family members and loved ones going to school, going to work, those sorts of things, that has a cumulative effect. And that when you have that concentrated to the degree that you do in the city of Baltimore and a lot of other cities across the country, it can be really it can be catastrophic for those neighborhoods, and it really requires the kind of services, supports for healing. And we don't have that in Baltimore. We don't have that in a lot of places. So when you ask people who live in a lot of these communities, what are they looking for? They're not going to say, "Oh, we want 20% more people locked up," right? They want to feel safe. They want to
Right,
be
right,
healthy. They
right,
want strength and
right,
vibrancy
right, right,
return to their community, and that
right,
comes by investing in the people who live there. That is unfortunately what we haven't seen. I think why we are where we are in a lot of ways is precisely because we've had sort of this top-down approach. People from outside of Baltimore, for example, making decisions. We already
right,
know
right.
former Governor Hogan. Baltimore was a popular punching bag for him whenever he needed to score political points,
Hmm.
and that is often the case for folks outside of the city. People thinking they know what's best, as opposed to saying, "Let's talk to the people who are in these neighborhoods and let's listen to them, ask them what they need, let's listen to them, and then invest in those things." And that's something that we haven't tried, and that's what
Right.
this report is attempting to try to draw attention to. This is not about necessarily just police, prosecutors, and prisons. This is about how we invest in strength in strong communities, and we're not doing that in places like Baltimore.
And I want our audience to be mindful of this, that we're talking about a community that was. I remember when at one point when Baltimore, when they used to have clean blocks. They used to have with the Air Force used to take, and they had a competition in the city, in Baltimore City, and everybody would took a lot of pride in their neighborhoods, would clean their block. Then they would give like block party, or the Air Force and other stores would sponsor block party, and the community was like real vibrant. And then we see what we see now, which leads me to the next element, the redlining. Shekhinah, talk about the redlining.
Okay, I'm going to defer to Ryan on the history of redlining
Come on, Ryan.
in Maryland.
Sure. I do want to pick up though. I'll talk about that, but I want to pick up on the comment that you had just
right. Come on.
mentioned before. So what you're describing is in the sort of academic literature, they call it collective efficacy, and collective efficacy means that the people in the community can come together collectively and can effectuate change. Right. So
Right.
you're talking about communities that were strong. Why? Because the community members themselves took pride in them. And one of the things that we see is that, and there is research, quantitative research, to show that the more you have system involved, more people being arrested, people coming in and out, incarcerated, being yanked on and off supervision and in and out of custody, it destabilizes communities.
That's right.
and it destroys those bonds. So in reality, by bringing in this external force of the police to bring in safety and not trusting the community members, you're taking away the ability for the community members to do the kinds of things you were talking about, to collectively create their own community in the same way that a lot of other safe, healthy neighborhoods can, where a parent can see another kid down the street, a neighbor says something, intervenes. That doesn't happen in communities where you have such high level system involvement. And so we actually see crime rates in the communities with the highest rates of incarceration are higher. And the reason they're higher is because a lot of the what we know works to prevent crime has been destabilized.
Right.
So I think that's a really important point that you raised, and I wanted to place that in that broader context.
And that's an accurate articulation. Come on. Redlining.
So as far as redlining is concerned, you mentioned earlier regarding the Inner Harbor and the investment there, and it's a perfect example. Right? There were actual decisions made by federal agencies that determine the risk of loans being given for people to buy homes. And so if you were in a green neighborhood, literally circled with a green pen, then that was considered low risk, where banks would be loaning. There's yellow, and then there was red. And you can probably guess what red is. Red means these are high risk loan areas. Right. Those red lines were drawn in neighborhoods and communities that were historically majority Black. And so in doing so, what banks said at that time, and this is all really sort of post-World War II, 1950, so the kind of big baby boom, when all of these neighborhoods and suburbs were growing up, that Black families that were looking to also build and expand in the same way white families were literally blocked, because banks were being told by the federal government that don't loan to these individuals, loan to these individuals. If you loan to these individuals over here in the redlined area, it's a higher risk of them not paying. And that obviously has had tremendous consequences for those communities. If you look at the redline neighborhoods in Baltimore in the last 50 years of the 20th century, and then coming into the beginning of the 21st century, unsurprisingly, the communities where there was investment, where there were people were put down roots and built homes and built families, so multi-generational, those communities are doing well. The ones that were redlined are not. So it's critically important. This is not by some coincidence. These were direct, deliberate decisions made. Right. They were made primarily because of racism, because these were neighborhoods that were predominantly Black. And here we are 70 some years later, and we're seeing all the consequences of that continue in a lot of these neighborhoods. So we created these problems, but the good thing about that is we can fix them.
Right. And I think, and then we moving now into the next step. Come on, Shekhinah. What is the next step? Because we recognize, and let me frame this, we recognize that poverty is you're being penalized for poverty. This report recognized that impoverished communities, the people that's in impoverished communities, they're going to be penalized, locked up, or subjugated to some type of social system that relegates them to being ineffective. In terms of the next step and investing in changing the narrative, talk about that.
The bottom line to me, and based on this report, is investing in communities is the best public safety strategy. We had just had a few weeks ago the state governor in his, I guess it was his official press conference
Mm-hmm.
of the year 2024, talking about his policy priorities, and a lot of it was around investments. And I was happy to hear that he talked a bit about communities that have been traditionally, historically disadvantaged. But I'm hoping that he really walks the walk in this situation, because this is what the problem is. They talk about the high crime rates, the violent crime, the gun violence, the youth violence, issues with juvenile justice. They want to roll back all the reforms that we fought so hard for over the past 5-10 years around criminal justice reform and juvenile justice reform. And they sort of have it backwards, right?
Right.
The investments should be on the front end, investing in these communities, and that is what builds the public safety. You talked a little bit, and Ryan talked a little bit about the closeness in communities, people taking collective responsibility for what goes on in their communities. That's a part of it. But there needs to be this, we need to establish sustainable funding sources to ensure support
Mm-hmm.
for both immediate and long-term investments.
Right. And you know what? I think as we get ready to close out on it, I think that we need to recognize that really is the solution, because this is when y'all saying 2.0, and we invest more monies into quality education, institutions that provide quality education, stop having food deserts, invest in communities and put stores in them communities, public housing. Because a person live in public housing don't mean that they want to live in a rat-infested environment, or an environment where trash is not collected. Ryan, talk about some of the solutions that y'all offer, because y'all was saying like look at private funding, track and monitor policies and program development to ensure that it's improving the assets needed and scaling to the community. Talk about some of these things as y'all outline how to make these investments, and more importantly, how to monitor and track them to ensure that we're not giving lip service to a problem, or the money's not going in the hands of poverty pimps.
Right. So the simplest solution is we need to listen to people who live in these neighborhoods. There are examples of this in other states, what are called community public safety investment, where community leaders partner with elected officials, with practitioners in the local or state government, where they take some dollars and resources and they invest them in certain interventions. They work with the community. The community themselves builds a plan where they'll have community leaders will come and say, here are the things that we are looking for. Here are 5 things that we need. And then you have, you can have technical assistance. Individuals can come in and help work up a strategic plan, work up a budget, and then and we're not talking about, you think about the hundreds of millions of dollars that are spent every year on police and locking people up.
Right.
For a small fraction of that, we can invest in these communities. A lot of times people are talking about community centers. They want parks. They want better lighting on the streets. They want clean streets, right? They want abandoned buildings to be cleaned up. These are little things that can be done that have a tremendous impact on public safety. And that, to me, I want to pick up on the point that Shekhinah made. Community investment is our most effective public safety strategy.
Yeah.
And we have data to prove it. There has been research that has shown that during declines in crime in the last 20, 30 years, that community-based organizations were a huge factor, that neighborhoods that had more engaged, more involved community-based organizations had better outcomes when it comes to crime. This is not rocket science. This is basic stuff. You invest in people, you have better outcomes. We know that. That's why we have an educational system. That's why we do this all across the country in a lot of different spheres, right? We just have to have this orientation when we think about what we're doing in our neighborhoods. And as I said earlier, right, it is an investment choice, $1 in policing or $1 to build in a community center, pre-K nurse home visiting for and family partnerships for young mothers. All of these factors out there that we've seen have effective outcomes long-term for individuals and reduce crime. That's where our money needs to be going.
All right, and as we close out, both of y'all can answer this. To the layperson, how do you want me to receive this report as a layperson? I'm the person living in Sandtown, Winchester. I'm the person that's been raised. I'm the grandmother that raised the whole neighborhood, and I see, and I can't move, but I know that I've got historical data to say that I lived in a vibrant environment. How do you want me to receive this report? Start with you, Shekhinah.
I would want you to receive the report, that grandmother, that mother, those people who live in the communities, to use this report or see it as a resource, because it provides the information. All it's doing is confirming what you have seen your entire life.
Mm-hmm.
We've given you the numbers, the statistics around the reality that you have lived. Now you can take that information and go to your leaders, elected officials on a community level, on a local level,
Mm-hmm.
on a city level, county
Mm-hmm.
level, and
Mm-hmm.
state level, and take that information to them and demand that, okay, you put the investments, the money is there. You're spending tax dollars on all this other stuff. The money's there. We're asking you to put it in these particular areas. And we can tell you from our firsthand experiences that this is the problem.
Right.
And
Brian,
this is
yeah,
the solution.
right. I like that. Brian.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add, I think these are data that right, these need to elected officials in Baltimore and elected officials in Annapolis, need to see these and say, what's going on here? This is not defensible, right? We cannot be 2024 in the United States of America, the wealthiest nation on earth, and have these neighborhoods that have are failing on every single possible social indicator.
Yeah.
It is unacceptable. And so as a resident, we now have these data. I find them, we have known this stuff for a long time, but still when you see these numbers, when you see it on a map and see how shocking it is, and to go and say, what are we going to do? Explain this to me as your constituent, and what are we going to do to make this differently? How do we get resources into these communities? That I would agree. I think that's a resource, and to try to hold our elected officials and stakeholders accountable.
And Shekhinah, tell our audience how we can get in touch with you, how they can get in touch with you and get a copy of the report.
Yes, you can just go to the Justice Policy Institute website, justicepolicy.org. And you can reach out to me directly at tbraveheart@justicepolicy.org.
And Ryan, how they can connect with you?
My same web address. My email address is rking, RKING, @justicepolicy.org.
There you have it, the real news. Thank you, Shekhinah Braveheart and Ryan King, for joining me as we rattle the bars. We ask that you continue to support the real news and rattling the bars. Because guess what? We really are the news.
Thank you so much for watching the Real News Network, where we lift up the voices, stories, and struggles that you care about most. And we need your help to keep doing this work. So please, tap your screen now, subscribe, and donate to the Real News Network. Solidarity forever.